Samantha sat at the kitchen table, her fingers absently tracing the rim of her coffee cup. The mug was still warm, but her mind was elsewhere, lost in the maze of thoughts that had been haunting her for days. Her husband, Mark, had been away on a business trip for almost a week now, but something felt off. He had been distant on the phone, his texts shorter than usual, and when she spoke to him, there was an odd hesitation in his voice, as if he were holding something back. Samantha couldn't put her finger on it, but the feeling in the pit of her stomach kept growing stronger with each passing day. It wasn't that she didn't trust Mark, she did, or at least she thought she did. They had been married for 5 years, and although there had been the occasional rough patch, their relationship had always been built on mutual respect and openness. At least, that's how it had always felt to her. But recently, something seemed different. Mark had started working longer hours, canceling their weekend plans, and when he left for this particular business trip, he hadn't seemed as enthusiastic as he normally did. He'd kissed her goodbye with the same routine affection, but there had been no excitement, no mention of what he would be doing or even when exactly he'd be back. She tried to brush it off at first. Maybe it was just the stress of work getting to him, she thought. Business trips could be exhausting, and Mark wasn't always the best at managing stress. But as the days wore on, she began to notice little things, small inconsistencies that started to accumulate in her mind. There had been a few times when Mark had sounded like he was in a hurry to end the conversation, even though they usually talked more on the phone when he was away. And then there was the matter of the texts. At first, they'd been frequent, but they gradually became less personal. No, I miss you, or can't wait to see you like he usually sent when he was on the road. Just simple updates, meeting finished, or I'll call you later. It was strange, and it was beginning to eat at her. Samantha wasn't one to jump to conclusions. She trusted Mark, but the unease in her chest was becoming harder to ignore. She decided to take a step back and think logically. Perhaps she was just overthinking things. After all, they had no reason to argue, no major issues in their marriage. Mark was a dedicated professional, and business trips were just part of his job. Yet the doubt kept creeping in, gnawing at her. That afternoon, she decided to do something she hadn't done before. She was going to call Mark's office. It wasn't a major step, but she needed some reassurance, something to tell her that everything was fine. Maybe she could confirm a few details about the trip, get a sense of his schedule, and put her mind at ease. Her fingers hovered over her phone for a moment before she dialed the number for his office. When the receptionist answered, Samantha hesitated for just a second, but then quickly explained that she was Mark's wife and was hoping to check in with him. "Hi, I'm just looking to see if Mark is in the office today. He's on a business trip and I just wanted to confirm his schedule," she said, trying to sound casual, but the nervousness in her voice was palpable. There was a pause on the other end, and then the receptionist spoke. "Oh, I'm sorry, Miss Turner, but Mark hasn't been in the office this week. I'm not sure where he is. I'll try to reach him for you, though." Samantha's heart skipped a beat. Her mind raced. What did that mean? Mark hadn't been in the office all week? She had just spoken to him yesterday, and he had told her he was in a meeting. Her mind reeled, as the pieces didn't seem to fit together anymore. Why hadn't Mark mentioned he wasn't going to be at the office? And why hadn't he mentioned it to her? The receptionist's voice pulled her back to reality. "Miss Turner, would you like me to leave a message for him?" Samantha felt a wave of frustration rise in her chest, but she controlled it, her tone still calm. "No, that's okay. I'll try calling him again later." She hung up the phone, her fingers trembling slightly. She wasn't sure what to think anymore. Was Mark lying to her? If he wasn't at work, where was he? The questions continued to swirl in her mind, growing more insistent. She didn't want to believe the worst, but now the seeds of doubt had been planted. It wasn't just the business trip anymore. It was everything. The rest of the day passed in a haze. Samantha tried to focus on her work, but every little noise or movement in the house seemed to set her off. She couldn't help but replay every conversation, every moment from the last few days. Was she missing something? Was Mark hiding something from her? It was that evening, as she sat down to a lonely dinner for one, that she finally made a decision. She had to know. She couldn't keep living with this feeling of uncertainty. She was going to see Emily. Emily had been her best friend for years, and the two of them had always been able to talk about anything. Samantha trusted her completely, and if there was anything going on, anything she needed to know, Emily would be the one to tell her. So she grabbed her coat and made the short drive to Emily's house, her mind still racing. When she arrived at Emily's front door, she felt a strange mix of hope and dread. Emily greeted her with a warm hug as usual, and they sat down in the living room to catch up. Samantha tried to push the nagging thoughts out of her mind, but they kept creeping back in. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that something wasn't adding up. Emily noticed the tension in her friend's face. "Is everything okay?" Emily asked, her tone soft, almost too soft. Samantha smiled, but the smile didn't reach her eyes. "Yeah, just a little stressed. Mark's been away on his business trip and She paused, unsure how to phrase it. "I don't know, Em. Something feels off. I called his office today and they said he hasn't been there all week, but he told me he was busy with meetings. I just don't get it." Emily looked at her for a moment, her expression unreadable. Then she shifted in her seat, looking down at her hands. Samantha felt a sudden unease. Something in Emily's demeanor had changed, but she couldn't place what it was. Her friends seemed distracted, as though she was avoiding eye contact. "Have you talked to him since?" Emily asked, her voice quiet. Samantha nodded. "Yeah, but his texts have been strange, short, and when we talk on the phone, he doesn't seem like himself. I don't know what's going on." Emily shifted again, and there was something almost nervous in her movements. Samantha felt her pulse quicken as a sense of foreboding settled over her. She needed to know what Emily was thinking. "Em," Samantha said, her voice a little sharper than she intended, "is there something you're not telling me? Is there something going on?" Emily looked up at her then, and for the briefest moment, their eyes met. There was a flicker of something Samantha couldn't quite read. And then, before she could respond, the doorbell rang. Samantha's heart skipped a beat. She had no idea why, but something about that moment felt wrong. Emily stood up to answer the door, and Samantha's eyes followed her. As Emily opened the door, her breath caught in her throat. There, standing in the doorway, was Mark. His eyes locked with Samantha's, and the silence between them was deafening. Mark's face drained of color, and he stammered, his voice shaky. "Samantha, I didn't." Samantha stood frozen, unable to comprehend what was happening. Her mind raced, and in that moment she realized with a sickening certainty that she had uncovered the truth. The silence in the room was suffocating. Samantha stood frozen, her heart pounding in her chest as her eyes locked with Mark's. Her body felt numb, as if the ground beneath her feet had disappeared. She had suspected something for days, but nothing had prepared her for the shock of actually seeing him there, in Emily's house, standing at the door, caught in the act of betrayal. Her thoughts scrambled for coherence, but nothing made sense. The confusion was overwhelming, and for a moment, she wondered if she was dreaming. Mark looked just as stunned as she felt. He opened his mouth to speak, but the words seemed to get caught in his throat. Emily, standing behind him, looked like she had seen a ghost, her face pale and her eyes darting between the two of them. Samantha's eyes moved from Mark to Emily and back again as the realization slowly started to settle in. Her best friend, the one person she'd trusted with everything, had been keeping this secret from her, and Mark, her husband, had been lying to her for who knew how long. "Samantha, Mark began, but his voice trailed off. He shifted his weight from one foot to the other, clearly uncomfortable. But the look in his eyes didn't reflect any of the guilt or remorse she had expected. Instead, there was a tinge of frustration, as if he had been caught off guard and didn't know how to react. Samantha's hands clenched into fists at her sides. Her mind was a whirlwind, but all she could focus on was the hurt that was slowly boiling to the surface. Her mouth went dry, and she found herself unable to speak for a moment, unsure of how to address the situation, unsure of how to even begin processing what she had just walked into. Emily cleared her throat, breaking the silence. "Samantha, I didn't know how to—" "Don't," Samantha said sharply, her voice shaking with barely contained anger. "Don't try to explain. I don't want to hear it." She felt her emotions crashing over her in waves. Anger, disbelief, and an overwhelming sense of betrayal. Emily had been her closest friend for years. They had shared everything, every worry, every joy, every secret. And now, here she was, standing in front of her, guilty of something that Samantha could never have imagined. Emily had known about Mark's lies. She had known and had said nothing. And Mark had lied to her face, telling her that he was on a business trip, when all along he had been here, with Emily. Samantha finally found her voice, though it came out in a low, trembling whisper. "How long has this been going on?" She could barely bring herself to say the words, but the question was out and there was no taking it back. Mark shifted uncomfortably, his gaze dropping to the floor, avoiding her eyes. It was the most cowardly thing he could have done, and it only made the hurt that much worse. Samantha wanted answers, not this silence, this avoidance. He had always been the one to stand up to things, to take responsibility when things went wrong, but now, in the face of his lies, he was shrinking away. Samantha, I didn't mean for it to happen," Mark said, his voice low and regretful, but Samantha could hear the flimsy nature of his words. His tone, though apologetic, didn't carry the weight of true remorse. It was too rehearsed, too practiced. It was the tone of someone who had been caught and was now trying to make excuses, trying to minimize the situation. "I didn't mean for it to happen," Samantha repeated, her voice rising with disbelief. "You're standing here, in my best friend's house, and you think that's going to make any of this better? You didn't mean for it to happen." Her words were cutting, but they felt necessary. She had to confront this. She couldn't pretend she wasn't seeing exactly what was happening. She couldn't pretend that she didn't know what had been going on behind her back. "I'm sorry, Samantha," Mark said, his voice quieter now. "I never wanted to hurt you. I didn't know how to—" "How long, Mark?" Samantha cut him off, her voice tight with fury. "How long has this been going on? Was it a week? A month? Or have you been lying to me this whole time?" There was a long pause. Emily stood awkwardly by the door, not daring to speak, her face a mixture of guilt and shame. Samantha didn't want to look at her, not right now, not when the betrayal was so fresh, so raw. Her focus was entirely on Mark, the man she had trusted above all else, the man she had vowed to spend her life with. Mark finally looked up, meeting her eyes for the first time since she had entered the room. His expression was a mix of regret and defensiveness, but there was something else. Something distant. It was as if he had already made up his mind about the situation, as if he had already accepted the consequences in his own way. 2 months, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Samantha felt as though the floor had been ripped out from under her. 2 months. 2 months of lies. 2 months of pretending everything was fine, of going about her life as if nothing had changed. And all the while, Mark had been seeing Emily, her best friend, the person she had trusted with her deepest secrets. How could they both betray her like this? "You've been seeing her behind my back for 2 months?" Samantha asked, her voice shaking. "And you thought I wouldn't find out? You thought I wouldn't figure it out?" Mark opened his mouth as if to speak, but the words never came. He just stood there, silently, as if he couldn't bring himself to offer any kind of explanation that would make it better. And Samantha realized, with a sinking feeling in her chest, that no explanation would ever make it better, not now, not after everything that had happened. She turned to Emily, her best friend, the person who had known about this betrayal the whole time. Emily's eyes were filled with tears, but Samantha didn't care. The sight of her tears only made the betrayal sting that much more. How could she stand there, looking so sorry, when she had allowed this to happen? "I trusted you," Samantha said, her voice thick with emotion. "You were supposed to be my best friend. How could you do this to me?" "I'm so sorry," Emily said, her voice barely audible, her hands wringing together in a nervous gesture. "I didn't want to hurt you. I didn't know what to do, Sam. It just happened." Samantha couldn't believe what she was hearing. It had just happened? As if any of this was some kind of accident. As if she could somehow accept the fact that Emily and Mark had betrayed her trust, and that all of it had happened by some strange, uncontrollable force? No, Samantha said firmly, shaking her head. No, this didn't just happen. You both made a choice. You chose to lie to me. You chose to hurt me. Her voice cracked as the realization hit her all at once. And I don't know if I can ever forgive you for that. She could feel the tears stinging at the corners of her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She refused to give either of them the satisfaction of seeing her break. She had been broken enough already. Mark, still standing by the door, took a step forward. Samantha, please, let me explain. Let me make this right. I don't want to hear it, Samantha interrupted, her voice cold. She had no interest in his explanations, no interest in anything he had to say. I don't want to hear how sorry you are, how much you didn't mean to hurt me. It doesn't matter anymore. Nothing you say will change what's already happened. She took a deep breath, trying to steady herself, but the anger and pain coursing through her was overwhelming. I want you both to leave, now. Mark and Emily exchanged a glance, but neither of them moved. They were both waiting for her to soften, to give in, but Samantha wasn't going to let them off the hook. Not this time. Not after everything they had done. I said leave, she repeated, her voice steady but firm. She wasn't going to beg them to go. She wasn't going to let them manipulate her into giving them another chance. This wasn't something that could be fixed with a few tears or empty apologies. She had been betrayed by the two people she trusted most in the world, and nothing could undo that. Finally, Mark nodded, his face a mixture of regret and defeat. Without another word, he turned and walked out the door, leaving Samantha alone with Emily, who was still standing in the doorway, her eyes wide and full of sorrow. Samantha didn't say anything else. She didn't have to. She couldn't find the words to explain the depth of her hurt, her disbelief, her fury. All she knew was that her life had just been shattered, and she didn't know how to pick up the pieces. The door clicked shut behind Mark, but the weight of the situation lingered in the air. Samantha stood there, her body frozen in the space where, just moments ago, she had confronted the two people she had trusted most in her life. Now, her mind was racing, her thoughts swirling around her like a chaotic storm. There was so much she didn't know, so much she still needed to process. How had things gotten to this point? How had Emily, her best friend, been part of this betrayal? The silence in the house was deafening. The kind of silence that made every breath feel too loud, every thought too heavy. Samantha felt the tears begin to sting at the back of her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She wouldn't give them that satisfaction. Not yet. She needed answers first. She needed to understand what had happened, how everything she had believed about her life had been turned upside down. Emily hadn't moved from the doorway, her eyes locked on Samantha, her face a mixture of guilt and uncertainty. She hadn't spoken since Samantha had told her to leave, and now the silence between them felt suffocating. Finally, Emily broke it, her voice shaky, almost pleading. Samantha, Please, just let me explain. Let me tell you everything. Samantha's heart clenched at the sound of her voice, the desperation that laced it. How could she even want an explanation? After everything? How could Emily stand there and still act like they could go back to normal, like they could undo the damage that had been done? Her voice, when it came, was cold, almost mechanical, as though she were speaking from a place far removed from the raw emotions she was feeling. Explain? Explain what, Emily? Samantha's words cut through the air like a blade. Explain how you betrayed me? How you slept with my husband behind my back? How you both lied to me, pretending everything was fine, while you were both deceiving me the entire time? The venom in her words hung in the air, but she didn't care. She didn't care if Emily's face crumpled in guilt or if her eyes filled with tears. She had no sympathy left for her. She had no empathy. The woman who had been her closest friend, who had stood by her through everything, was now the person who had shattered her world. Emily's face turned pale and her lips trembled as she tried to speak. I never wanted to hurt you. I never wanted this to happen. Samantha let out a bitter laugh, the sound hollow and hollowing. You didn't want to hurt me. You've been hurting me this whole time, Emily. Every minute you kept this secret from me, every time you lied to me, you were hurting me. You've been lying to my face for 2 months, and now you think I'm just going to forgive you because you didn't mean to?" Emily took a hesitant step forward, but Samantha took an instinctive step back. She couldn't stand to be near her. Not right now. Not when everything about their relationship had been tainted. Not when the woman she had trusted most had betrayed her in the worst possible way. "I know I can't make up for what I've done," Emily said quietly, her voice thick with emotion. "But please, Sam, I never wanted this. It just happened, and I didn't know how to stop it." "It just happened? Is that your excuse? You didn't know how to stop it?" Samantha's voice rose again, the sharpness in her tone echoing through the room. "You knew exactly what you were doing, Emily. You knew what you were doing when you let Mark into your bed. You knew what you were doing when you kept this from me. And now you want me to believe that it was some sort of accident? That you just couldn't control yourselves?" Emily's eyes welled with tears and her voice trembled as she spoke. "I'm so sorry, Sam. I know there's nothing I can say to fix this, but I never meant to hurt you. I was stupid and I was selfish and I didn't think about the consequences. I thought I could keep it hidden, but I see now that was wrong. I see now that I've lost you, and I deserve that. I deserve you to hate me, but please, believe me when I say that I never wanted this. I never wanted to destroy our friendship." And Samantha's chest tightened at the sound of Emily's words. But the sting of betrayal was still too fresh, too raw, to allow any part of her to feel sorry for her. She wanted to be angry. She needed to be angry, because if she allowed herself to soften, if she allowed herself to listen to Emily's apologies, then she was admitting that it didn't matter. That it didn't matter that her best friend had slept with her husband. That it didn't matter that the people she had trusted most had torn her apart. "I can't believe this," Samantha whispered, her voice broken but firm. "I can't believe you'd do this to me. How could you, Emily? How could you betray me like this? After everything we've been through together." "I don't have an answer for that," Emily said, her voice barely audible, her hands clasped in front of her as if she were pleading for some kind of forgiveness. "I don't know why it happened. I don't know why I didn't stop. But I'm sorry. I can't undo what I've done, but I'm so sorry." Samantha's mind felt like it was unraveling. She didn't want to hear any more apologies. She didn't want to hear about how sorry Emily was or how much she regretted it. It didn't matter. Nothing mattered anymore. The hurt was too deep. The betrayal too raw. She shook her head, unable to speak for a moment. The lump in her throat made it hard to breathe, but she forced herself to stand tall. She had to, for herself. "I need you to leave," Samantha said, her voice low but firm. "I don't want to hear it anymore. I don't want to hear how sorry you are. I don't want to hear any more excuses." Emily looked as if she had been slapped, her face contorting in pain, but Samantha didn't feel the usual comfort of empathy that she would have felt in another situation. This wasn't the time. She couldn't allow herself to feel sorry for Emily, not now. Not when she had just destroyed everything. "You need to leave. Now," Samantha repeated, her voice unwavering. "I understand," Emily said quietly, her words hanging in the air between them like a heavy burden. "I'll go. But Sam, I hope one day you can forgive me. I really do." Samantha didn't respond. She didn't have the energy to argue anymore. She couldn't pretend to be the woman she had been before all this. She couldn't pretend to be okay. Not after everything she had just learned, not after seeing the truth with her own eyes. Emily stood there for a long moment, her gaze lingering on Samantha with a mixture of sadness and regret. But she didn't move. She didn't leave. She just stood there, frozen in place. Samantha knew she had to be the one to make the first move. She had to be the one to push Emily out of her life, because if she didn't, she wasn't sure she'd ever be able to get the distance. Finally, Emily turned and walked to the door. Samantha didn't move to stop her. She didn't say another word. She didn't have to. The silence in the house was the only thing left now, and it spoke volumes. The door opened with a quiet creak, and Emily stepped out of the house, disappearing into the night. Samantha stood in the middle of the room, her body shaking with a mixture of anger, pain, and disbelief. She wanted to collapse. She wanted to curl up into a ball and block everything out. But she couldn't. She couldn't allow herself that luxury. Not when she had to figure out how to move forward, how to face the reality of her life now, how to figure out what came next. She collapsed onto the couch, burying her face in her hands. The tears came then, hot and fast, as if they had been waiting to break free all this time. Samantha didn't try to stop them. She let them come, because there was no holding them back anymore. The hurt, the betrayal, the loss, it was all too much to bear. The life she had built, the trust she had placed in both Emily and Mark, was gone, and she didn't know if she could ever get it back. She didn't know how to move on. She didn't know how to fix any of this. But one thing was certain, she had to find a way to rebuild. It wouldn't be easy. It would be a long, painful journey, but she had no choice. She had to move forward. For herself. The days after Emily left were a blur. Samantha felt like she was living in a fog, her mind constantly replaying the events of that night, questioning every moment, every word. It was as though the ground beneath her feet had shifted, and now she was struggling to find solid ground again. She couldn't recall the last time she had felt so alone, so utterly betrayed by the people she trusted most. But in a strange way, the quiet of her house, the empty house, was a relief. For the first time in days, the overwhelming noise in her mind had quieted. It was as if the silence was a balm for her soul, even if it was cold and uncomfortable. Mark hadn't called, he hadn't texted, he had disappeared, and Samantha had no idea where he was, what he was doing, or if he even cared. He had gone to the business trip he had originally claimed to be on, but something about the way he left made it feel like he was simply running away. It was almost as though he couldn't face the reality of what he had done, or worse, that he didn't care enough to try. For days she had expected a message, an apology, an explanation, something. But the silence from him was deafening, and part of her was grateful for it. It meant she didn't have to face the man who had once been the love of her life. Not yet, at least. Samantha spent the next few days navigating her new reality. She didn't know how to feel. She was filled with an intense mix of anger, hurt, and confusion. But underneath all of that, there was a faint sense of relief. It was a relief that she hadn't expected, one that was hard to embrace at first. But the more she thought about it, the more she realized something. The life she had lived with Mark and Emily, the life she had worked so hard to build, was built on lies, and now she had the chance to rebuild. It was painful, yes. It felt like the earth had been torn from under her, and she was left to figure out how to stand again. But it was also an opportunity for freedom. Freedom from the lies, freedom from the people who had betrayed her, freedom to become who she was meant to be without their influence. Angela. The days turned into a week, and Samantha slowly started to pick up the pieces of her life. She called in sick to work for a few days, unable to face the normalcy of her office, unable to pretend like everything was fine. Instead, she stayed home, spent time alone, and allowed herself to grieve. She cried more than she thought possible, but at the same time, she found strength in the tears. It was as if each sob was washing away the pain and the anger, leaving her with something new. Something she hadn't felt in a long time, a sense of clarity. One evening, as she sat at her kitchen table, her fingers absent-mindedly tracing the rim of her coffee cup, her phone buzzed. Samantha's heart skipped a beat, the anticipation of the message making her stomach tighten. She glanced at the screen, half expecting it to be from Mark. But instead, it was a text from her sister, Sarah. "Hey, Sam, just checking in. I know it's been rough, but I'm here for you. Let me know if you want to talk or if you need anything. I love you." The words were simple, but they were enough. Samantha's breath caught in her throat as a wave of gratitude washed over her. She hadn't spoken to Sarah in weeks, but in that moment, her sister's support felt like a lifeline. It was what she needed. It was what she had been missing in the days since everything fell apart. Samantha quickly typed a reply. "Thank you, Sarah. I don't know what to say. It's been hard, but I'll be okay. Just need some time." Huh? Her phone buzzed again almost immediately. "Take all the time you need. I'll be here when you're ready. Let's have a coffee soon. I miss you." Samantha smiled for the first time in what felt like days. It wasn't much, but it was a reminder that she wasn't completely alone. There were people who cared about her, people who wanted to help her heal, and that was more than enough. The next few days were a mix of taking baby steps toward healing and battling the waves of grief that kept crashing over her. Samantha went for long walks, her thoughts drifting as she wandered aimlessly through the streets of her neighborhood. She started journaling again, something she hadn't done in years. It felt therapeutic to put her thoughts on paper, to give them form and structure. She began to feel more connected to herself, as if the writing was helping her piece together the fragments of who she had been before the betrayal, the woman she wanted to become again. But the question still loomed. What now? What did the future hold? Samantha didn't have all the answers, but for the first time in weeks, she realized she didn't need them. She didn't need to have everything figured out right away. She didn't need to understand why Mark and Emily had done what they did. What mattered now was that she was moving forward, one small step at a time. Then, one morning, as the sun began to peek through the blinds, casting a warm glow over her living room, there was a knock at the door. Samantha's heart skipped, the familiar sense of dread filling her chest. It wasn't a visitor she had expected. When she opened the door, her breath caught in her throat. Standing in front of her was Mark. He looked the same, but there was something different in his eyes. He seemed smaller somehow, as if the weight of the past week had taken its toll on him. He was dressed casually, but his posture was tense. He was nervous, and for the first time in a long time, Samantha found herself feeling some level of sympathy for him. But she quickly pushed that aside. Sympathy didn't change what he had done. Sympathy didn't undo the damage. "Sam," Mark said quietly, his voice rough, "can we talk?" Samantha didn't say anything at first. She just stood there, her eyes locked on his, trying to gauge if he had changed, if he was truly sorry for what had happened, or if he was simply seeking an escape from the guilt he had been living with. She wasn't sure, but what she did know was that she didn't owe him anything. She didn't owe him an explanation. She didn't owe him an explanation. What she owed herself now was the chance to reclaim her life, her dignity, and her future. "I don't think we have anything left to talk about, Mark," Samantha said, her voice steady but distant. "You made your choice. You and Emily both made your choices, and now it's time for me to make mine." Mark flinched at her words, and for a brief moment Samantha saw the man she had once loved in his eyes. But that man was gone. The man standing in front of her now was a stranger, someone she no longer recognized. "I never wanted to hurt you," Mark said, his voice breaking. "I know I messed up. I know I ruined everything. But I love you, Sam. I always have." Samantha felt a pang in her chest, but she refused to let it control her. "Love?" she repeated, her voice tight. "Is that what you call it? What you did to me? What you did to us?" "I was wrong," Mark said, his voice desperate now. "I was stupid, and I didn't think about the consequences. I didn't think about how much you meant to me until it was too late." Samantha shook her head, stepping back from the door. "It's too late, Mark. I don't need you to tell me how sorry you are. I don't need you to explain yourself anymore. I need to move on. And that means I need to move on from you." Mark stood there for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then, without saying another word, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the street. Samantha watched him go, the weight of the moment settling heavily in her chest. But there was no relief in it, no satisfaction. She simply closed the door and leaned against it, taking a deep breath. It was done. It was over. And yet, as she stood there, a strange calmness washed over her. It wasn't the kind of peace she had expected, the kind that came with closure. It was something different, something quieter, something more profound. She was alone, but for the first time that didn't feel like the end of the world. It felt like the beginning of something new. Samantha smiled softly to herself as she turned away from the door. She didn't have all the answers yet, and she knew the road ahead would be difficult. But she was no longer afraid. For the first time in a long time, she felt a sense of hope. She was going to be okay. She was going to rebuild, one step at a time. And whatever happened, she knew she would never let herself be controlled by the lies and the betrayal again. It wasn't going to be easy, it wasn't going to be quick, but it was her journey now, and she was ready to take the first step.